Hello, and welcome to Why Wars Happened, a weekly history podcast where we talk about what led to war in history. I'm your host, Emily Ross, and today we're going to be discussing the things that led to the American Revolution, with a focus on Virginia this season. Okay, so where we left off in the last episode was that the Virginia government had asserted their control over the governor and made it known that they would not have these powers taken from them. In 1658, the Lord Protector of England, Oliver Cromwell, finally died. And surprise, surprise, his son inherited his position, just like a king. And make no mistake, Oliver Cromwell, who led the overthrow of the tyrannical King Charles I and was essential to bringing about the execution of Charles I, was a worse tyrant than the king he had murdered. So now Oliver Cromwell had died, and his son, Richard Cromwell, was now the Lord Protector of England and her territories. But, fortunately for history's sake, he wasn't a very good leader. People didn't have confidence in him either, and it appears that at one point the English army had even arrested him. Just 9 months after becoming Lord Protector, Richard Cromwell resigned his power and England started to turn back to what it was before the Revolution and the tyranny of the Cromwells. They invited Charles II, the son of the king they had executed, to come back to England and sit on the throne as their king. This process, however, took about a year to complete. And during that year, England was a hot mess. Nobody knew for certain who the top person was or would be. Who would solve the issues that needed immediate attention? Who would this group answer to? Who would that group send their pleas to? And the military was just as chaotic and full of uncertainty as Parliament was. The entire machine of English war and politics was based around who their leader was, who they pledged their loyalty to, who sat on the throne and guided them with rules and ideas that everyone lined up to center around or to fight around. The colonists didn't need a leader in England as much as the English citizens did. After all, they were an entire ocean away and they had their own functioning government. Let's not forget that while Oliver Cromwell was leading England, he basically left Virginia alone to do whatever they wanted. They had many years of self-government at this point, and so it wasn't really that challenging for them to be without an English leader. Nevertheless, the colonists still considered themselves Englishmen. They still did need a leader to guide them, and they still considered England as the final say in whatever laws and rules they were supposed to live by. So they did need a leader, but it wasn't as desperate of a need as it was for the people in England. Even so, the colonists had some anxiety about who was going to ultimately sit as a leader. Would Parliament end up leading without a king again? Would the king actually come back? Would some other thing happen? Who knows? England had just fought an entire civil war over the issue of getting rid of kings. Like the Civil War just ended 10 years ago. Would the king actually come back? It seemed unlikely. Or maybe it was likely. Who knows? So they waited, and imagined all of the things they could gain or lose depending on who the leader ended up being. In the end, it seems that they thought it was most likely the king would come back. In the midst of all of this, Governor Matthews died, just about 3 months before the king was restored to the throne of England. In order to restore order and certainty in the colony, the Virginia Assembly passed a law stating that the Assembly itself was the supreme power in Virginia until, and this is important, until England commanded them differently. That's really important because, again, even with an opportunity like this, where England is chaotic and the colonists could easily assert their independence, they didn't want to. They could have used that decade of being left to govern themselves under Cromwell and used the chaos in England as the perfect time to just say, we're going to break off. But they didn't. I can't stress this enough that the colonists, at least in Virginia, absolutely did not want independence from Britain until it was the extreme last option after over 100 years of trying out other options and remaining part of Britain. Okay, so bringing us to the next point was that the Assembly didn't want to have this supreme power forever. Even if they didn't desperately need a king right now, straight away, they did need a head of their own colonial government. They needed a governor. They chose the person who had displayed a fierce, undying love for the king through it all, even through the king being executed and Parliament taking over. That man was Governor Berkeley, their old governor who resigned after Parliament sailed up the James River and forced Virginia into obedience. Parliament had allowed him 1 year to gather his stuff and get out of the colony, but he had never left. Keep in mind that Governor Berkeley was well loved by the people. He had fought for the rights of Virginians, stood at the helm of defending them against attacks, and ensured justice prevailed throughout Virginia when he was their governor. Even his critics said that not they, nor anyone who might call him an enemy, had a bad word to say about him personally. This may have been a little bit of an exaggeration, but just know that he was very much loved in the colony. The Assembly issued an order stating that Berkeley would again be their governor. In the order, they talked about his great justice and integrity, and how well Virginia did under his leadership, and how many people approved of him. The Assembly unanimously agreed that in the 25 years they had known him, not one person had issued a complaint against him, and that anyone who did was confused or mistaken. And furthermore, the people wished him to be their governor for the rest of his life. The truth is that he was a good governor, and Virginia did do well under his rule. However, they did well under other governors, and they even did well while left alone during Cromwell's rule, without England there to guide them. Other than the Navigation Acts, that is. Governor Berkeley's devotion to the king might have also been part of the reason the Assembly chose him. If the king were restored, surely he would grant them favors and love because a loyal servant of his was their governor. Plus, it had the added benefit of ensuring a peaceful transition to a king again. With king-loving best buddy Governor Berkeley at the helm of the colony, there would be no resistance to the king if he were to resume power. However, Berkeley doesn't seem to have been too excited about taking the reins of power again. He did accept the position, but he delivered a speech to the Assembly in which he thanked them, but also said that he was cautious of, quote, assuming this burden, which is so volatile, slippery, and heavy that I may justly fear that it will break my limbs. He also said that he was afraid the king might see his acceptance of the governorship as a sign that Berkeley thought he didn't need the king's authority to give him that position. He was terrified of the king disapproving of him. The Assembly assured him that if the king's enemies were the ones who came to power in England, he would be allowed to step down so he wouldn't serve the king's enemies. If the king returned to power in England, they would request the king's permission to allow Berkeley to be their governor, thereby recognizing the king's authority. To all of this, Berkeley finally agreed. So, in 1660, Governor Berkeley became the governor of Virginia for the second time. The representatives of the people had gotten their beloved governor back, and they were ready to charge ahead into the sunshine and blessed future. But the blessed future would not be so, for the old governor had grown bitter and inflexible. There was a storm brewing among the people that had its origins in the beginning of William Berkeley's second term as governor. Soon, the growing colony would find itself plagued by natural disasters, death, and rebellion. The first signs of trouble came almost immediately. Charles II, the restored King of England, affirmed the Navigation Acts. The king was indeed grateful to Governor Berkeley for his loyalty and for his acknowledgement that he needed the king's approval to be governor. Of course, he gave his approval to Berkeley. Governor Berkeley wrote to King Charles saying that, quote, I do most humbly throw myself at your majesty's feet, in a dutiful thankfulness to your majesty that you yet think me worthy of your royal commands. I always, in all conditions, had more fear of your majesty's frowns than the swords or tortures of your enemies. So the king was happy, the colonial governor was happy, the people were happy. The colony itself had been growing, rapidly growing. When the civil wars broke out in England, the population of Virginia was around 15,000. Now, 10 years later, the population had almost tripled. It was now around 40,000 people. So back to the Navigation Acts. Order must be restored. The people who run the machine of England and the colonies must have what they need, and the bond between England and her territories must be strengthened, with England being made clear as the ruler in the relationship. Remember in previous episodes we talked about the Navigation Acts. They had been passed by Oliver Cromwell and his Parliament 10 years ago. They said that countries other than England couldn't navigate to the colonies and sell things there. And they also said that the colonies couldn't navigate somewhere other than England to sell or buy things. Everything had to go from England or to England. Those were basically what the Navigation Acts were. But during Oliver Cromwell's reign, he was busy tying up loose ends of the Civil War and dealing with other political things at home. So he kind of left the colonies to govern themselves for around 10 years. And during that time, the colonies completely ignored the Navigation Acts. Now that the new king was restored to the throne, he was going to impose the Navigation Acts. And this time, he was going to make sure that they were strictly enforced. That's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Join us next week when we discuss how Charles II, as new king, would make life harder for the colonists, and how Virginia's economy went into the toilet because of the Navigation Acts. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and comment your thoughts on this episode below. See you next time on Why Wars Happened.